next, we have Collin Mechler, who is the Director of Practice Leads for Domo. And Colin he really specializes in large-scale digital transformations. He runs the Domo's practice areas, a group that has an industry of technology experts that are charged really with the goal to provide a stronger impact value for Domo's customers and Domo's clients. Colin himself is an expert in supply chain, retail, manufacturing, and particularly in the advanced tech of AI, ML, and IoT and data science. So we're really looking forward to having him talk today. He's going to be discussing modernizing your business intelligence. I think it's a great flow into what we just heard from Will and Nicole. And we are very lucky to have Colin here in person joining us. He flew in from beautiful Salt Lake City yesterday. So Colin, it's all yours. Thank you so much for joining us in person.
Thanks for the good intro, Tom. Here, I'm going to raise this a little bit. You guys hear me okay? Hey, folks, thanks very much. Thanks for the intro. My name is Collin Mechler. I work at Domo. Domo is a data platform company that specializes in making data more accessible and translatable to business users. Much or most of the partnership between Domo and RxA, as a matter of fact, is Domo is the platform that RxA works their magic on top of. So we have a long, kind of strong history here. And personally, so I've been with Domo for about a year. Prior to Domo, I worked at an AI think tank / enterprise tech company where I ran the supply chain, retail, and manufacturing business there. I have built a bit of a specialty over the years of the concept of productionizing AI. So in other words, making it actually stick. I am a very passionate technology guy. I'm a reformed engineer is typically how I introduce myself to people. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about some pitfalls and common challenges. I've been working in AI for quite some time, worked with a couple hundred customers now at this point, customers and clients on the topic of AI and digital transformation subjects. And I've had far more failures than successes when it comes to AIML, which I think is pretty par for the course. And so a lot of lessons to be learned there. And then we'll talk a little bit about how Domo makes it easier. And frankly, just full disclosure, this was a big reason why I joined Domo about a year ago, is that a lot of the aspects that Domo excels at are often the challenges that we see acting as barriers to entry for the adoption of AIML. All right, so I'm going to start off with a little bit of a statistic, and my hope is that this is not really much of a surprise to anybody, especially for those of you practitioners in the room and virtually. Hopefully, it should be pretty obvious that only about 8% of customer or companies have deployed an AI model into production. I've seen at this point, so this particular study is about 2 years old. I've seen probably a half a dozen or so credible studies come up, from IBM and McKinsey and BCG and those folks. All more or less saying the same thing. Somewhere around 8 to 10% of companies have deployed a model into production, right? It gets at how hard it is, and I think the quote that comes to mind for this and the origin of this particular quote, or the original one that this is adapted from, I probably can't repeat in professional, polite company, but I see AI like teenage driving, right? Everyone talks about it. Nobody knows how to do it. Everyone thinks that everyone else is doing it well, and so everyone claims that they're doing it well too, right? And but the reality is quite the opposite. I've worked with clients that have spent over $100 million in just their AI infrastructure and operations teams. They've stood up dedicated centers of excellence out in Silicon Valley, only for it to fail a year or two later. So there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from that experience. You'll also hear this notion of modernizing business intelligence. When I think about what business intelligence connotes, I think for many of us, myself included, I tend to think of this team that gets sequestered oftentimes in the IT organization, kind of often sort of a no man's land, producing reports, right? Maybe producing dashboards if we're lucky, right? Those reports then get sent to somebody who sends them to somebody else, who maybe consolidates them with some data that they've got in a spreadsheet on their desktop, and then gets sent to somebody else, and then somebody finally makes a decision with it. And if you spend enough time with people at Domo, we'll talk a lot about this notion of modernizing business intelligence and what it actually means. And so I think easy to distill it into three major buckets, right? Ultimately, what we're trying to do here is use a clever cocktail of UX techniques, software development techniques, and enterprise architecture techniques to be able to solve cooler problems and make it more accessible to business people. So first and foremost, gaining access to more of your data across more of your business. One theme that we say a lot within Domo is getting access to 100% of your data across 100% of your business. It's a lofty goal, but we see there's this notion of dark data that we champion a lot here, where there's data that lives on laptops and in spreadsheets, and oftentimes the same data set has 50 different clones depending on who owns it, right? And when you have that many clones of the same data set, that means it's not trustable. So how do we get data trustable? How do we provide a singular, consolidated, streamlined mechanism that we can manage our data more effectively so that we can ultimately make better decisions with it? The second piece of it has to do with creating new consumers of data, right? Bringing data to the edge of your business. We love working with BI and analytics teams. Data and analytics teams are our bread and butter and the foundation, and in many cases, they happen to be the best consumers of data, right? They know data, they have the scars to show for it, frankly. They've been there, done that, they've been in the trenches. And so oftentimes we can find really common ground quite easily as a team. But if we can augment that specialization and that access with new user communities, frankly, who haven't really had access to data previously. We've heard marketing come up a couple of times in the previous session, and we'll continue to hear marketing come up a lot over the course of the day. Domo's got another session with Christy and Steven here where we're going to get more of a deep dive into a marketing use case. And the reason I think marketing is such a good space to play in as an example is that it's a big greenfield. That is traditionally an area for a lot of companies where it's been a bit of a digital no man's land. There's a lot of data sources that I need to be able to understand. But from a technology support perspective, it's been difficult to provide those teams the support that they need. And so they're just so hungry and oftentimes very desperate for something that can just make sense of it all, which is why I think we see so many opportunities living in that space. If we can make champions of those marketing operations people, the business people making the decisions on where do I spend my money more effectively, for example, that complements the core data and analytics expertise that I already happen to have had. Right? And frankly, I don't need to hire an army of engineers to be able to support it as well. The third piece is fostering a data and decision-oriented culture, right? Excuse me. So taking business action and making it more real time, right? This gets to the enterprise architectural aspects. Native SaaS development has really been a boon for us as a company, as well as a number of other systems out there and software vendors, because it allows us to be much more flexible with our architecture. It allows us to scale infinitely. When I can do that, that means that I can, frankly, address larger data problems more quickly. If I can solve a bigger problem more quickly, that means I can embed it more into the workflow that the business user is in charge of, right? That means that they're taking more accurate decisions in a more real-time fashion, right? They're not waiting on a result that takes 12 hours to run, for example, or having to go with an answer that was provided yesterday, right? They're able to see what the most real-time answer should be, right? And being able to make sense of it. That also means that, frankly, a lot of new advanced techniques in IoT, data science, machine learning are now available to us when they weren't previously, just because of the sheer quantity of data required to be able to do it. So what we're seeing, right, to enable businesses to solve harder problems, right, more and more companies are turning to AIML, data science, which I'm distinguishing from AIML, but really they kind of fall into the same general category of problem-solving types. IoT, embedded analytics, consumer-oriented apps. This group here that you see here right in the middle of the slide is what I call kind of advanced technology, right? And I can talk till I'm blue in the face on the stuff to the right, so IoT, embedded analytics, and consumer-oriented apps. We won't today. Today we're going to focus on data science and AIML. The challenge, though, is that getting it to stick is really hard, right? It can't provide business value until it's deployed into production in a safe, sustainable, self-sufficient, and performant fashion, right? And so today, that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to talk about how Domo helps make this sticky. This is going to be complemented again, shameless plug, with a session at noon Eastern with Christy and Steven around a specific marketing data science use case, right? So, and I'm going to dig a little bit, very kind of skim the surface into some lessons that I've personally learned over the years on why making AI production ready is pretty tough. Okay? For starters, the process is different. I think one common pitfall that I see, or one mindset shift that is needed, deals with the fact that a lot of us are trying to take traditional DevOps software development practices and just apply them to AIML problems. So ML Ops is a new concept that the ML team on the phone will be very familiar with. But it's this notion that's very iterative, right? One of the defining characteristics of ML Ops is a natural need to be iterative. In traditional DevOps software development methodologies, it's all about efficiency, reducing churn, right? In fact, there are systems out there that measure how much churn or how much rework a developer has to do so that I can ensure that they're as efficient as possible, right? In AI exploration, frankly, we need that, right? We need that iteration because that's where the innovation takes place. And so how do you foster that? How do you reconcile that with, frankly, the efficient leading needs of DevOps? And frankly, I need to build a piece of software. I need to build a package that this gets deployed to the business within. The steps are different. They're frankly a greater quantity. I'm not going to go through all these. It's purposefully small on the screen so that you guys can't really read it and we don't spend a lot of time on it. But I think at a high level, we can distill them into 5 basic themes. First is onboarding. Business problem definition. Honestly, if there's one thing that I can probably not overstate, it's that all of this has to start with a business problem, right? That's a huge pitfall that I see a lot that frankly I don't spend enough time on this presentation with, as a matter of fact, is too many projects get started at a technical level but don't have the business complement to say, why am I even doing this, right? There was a question in the previous group that I think was answered really, really well by the speakers in the previous session that asked about where do I get started, right? And my first question is, well, what do you want to do, right? And so I think that always has to be top of mind. So the second piece is pipeline development, data readiness, data, right? The larger the quantity, your data, the more challenges that will come with it, right? It's going to become this death by 1,000 paper cuts affair, right? Things that you do in a laboratory setting to tweak data or visually inspect it or manually cleanse it or whatever, right? There's no way that you can handle that at scale, right? And we'll get into that in a second. AI building and experimentation is the next piece. Construction and packaging. Ultimately, I've got to deploy this, right? And so it's got to be in a form factor that makes sense to the person consuming it. And usually the person consuming it is not going to be a data scientist. The person consuming it is going to be a business user who has to make a decision on it. And then finally, the last piece is deployment and monitoring. Do not underestimate the importance of monitoring, right? Because especially with machine learning algorithms where they have to be retrained, what we see is data degradation, right? Model performance degrades over time as new data comes in. We call it data drift, right? How do I model that? How do I see what's taking place? How do I build in automatic alerts or, frankly, automatic retraining loops to be able to ensure that the model is always as accurate as it should be, okay? And then to make matters worse, it doesn't actually look like a circle. It's a heck of a lot more complicated. I frankly should have made this slide a lot more difficult to read, but you know, there's only so much time we can spend on these things. So the point, of course, is that this is a very iterative process. Things that I do as I start developing these solutions, I end up learning new things that inform what I should have known, quote unquote, early on in the process, right? And then that informs things downstream, right? And so this is a very iterative, kind of multifaceted process. And then on top of all of that, I've got multiple teams that I'm having to interact with as well. Okay, so in addition to there being business initiatives that may not be exactly the same as BI team initiatives or data and analytics initiatives, which may not be the same as the IT team's initiatives, I've also got individual systems and tools in place that make it sometimes a little bit challenging to reconcile or streamline that process, right? And so what we're after and what Domo's trying to help solve is what if I have a way that all of us can be happy in one place, right, that makes it a lot more conducive to that collaboration that's so critical to this process. So now's where I start to get a little bit into Domo here. The core aspects of Domo really is this end-to-end platform. The cool thing about it, which I like about it, and frankly, like I said at the top, this was a big reason why I came to join Domo, is how modular it is. It can be used end-to-end, holistically, right, as a complete set of tools that I can provide to someone, you know, from end to end, or it can be used modularly, right? All I need is this piece to support this one function, right? So you look at our Snowflake partnership, for example. This is a really good example of this. We have stuff that, frankly, functionally overlaps with Snowflake, but if we can layer Domo on top of Snowflake, now all of a sudden what we've unlocked is an ability to take the strong data warehousing capabilities of Snowflake and make it business relevant, right? And the way that we do that, frankly, is taking that modularity, right, and taking advantage of it. At the end of the day, it boils down to data, insights, action, and application of that, right? And I'm not going to get too down into the weeds. We'll actually see, I believe, a product demo when Christy and Steven talk. So I'll just keep shamelessly plugging that session here. I think the best way to summarize this is that what we specialize in is cleaning up what was previously hard, right? I have a good story from the last place I worked. What we specialized in, I said this was the last place I worked was a AI think tank. And what we specialized in was solving very difficult problems for frankly, very large clientele, right? And these were, the way that we solved is we had an army of about 250 PhDs on staff, and we were literally inventing the algorithms that were needed to solve these problems. These were never before solved, and it was a very exciting place to be right at the tip of the spear. In working on a project with a client, I brought on board a scientist who was fairly new to the company, who had just finished his postdoc work, and so this is his first real world, company that he'd worked for, and very smart guy, PhD in, I think it was physics, but he was a machine learning guy, specialized in deep learning techniques, and I asked him how it was going. Right? How's life in the real world? And he was kind of down in the dumps about it. He said, well, honestly, I'm a little disappointed. I didn't realize that I'd be spending 95% of my day fooling around with data. I thought, when I was doing grad school and in postdoc, I was making cool models all the time, right? The data sets worked. And then I didn't realize how bad everybody's data is. And in fact, one of these days, I'm probably going to write a book called Everyone's Data is Bad and You May or May Not Know It. And that's just the way it is, right? Everyone's data has challenges, and especially when you go to the scale that's needed. And in our case, we were solving deep learning, which just makes it worse because you're needing orders of magnitude more data oftentimes than more shallow techniques. It gets very difficult to scale. And so, and you spend a lot of time cleaning up data. And so what we think about at Domo, and what really attracted me to Domo, frankly, was what if I can help turn that from 95% of my day messing around with data to 50% of my day, right? What does that free up? What new opportunities does that present to me for me to focus on higher value activities, right? On top of this, the core data science mojo that we have, right, and advanced technology mojo, we also have an AutoML component too. There are certain types of problems that benefit well from a more streamlined and automated process to be able to use AutoML techniques. There's a massive business advantage, and we heard about it on the previous session, in being able to automate a lot of these data science processes. The best way I can think about what AutoML does is imagine that sci-fi movie, right? The hero, gets stabbed by an alien, right? And his guts get spilled out, right? And he's gonna die. And so we stick him in a pod where there's this robot that seals him back up, and within an hour he's back to fighting aliens. And what that was doing is it took a very complex concept like operating on somebody and healing them and automated it, right? That's effectively what we're after with AutoML. There are certain types of problems that, frankly, we can do that with, right? Certain types of challenges, classification problems are a good example, where I may not necessarily need the best algorithm, right? I just need an algorithm that works. And being able to marry that with a tool that automatically combs through the top, most common classification algorithms out there, right, for me on my behalf to select what the best one is, that's more value to me oftentimes than it would have been for me to find the absolute best thing that absolutely works, right? There's a lot that goes into this, right? And this is why I say for certain types of business problems, because sometimes AutoML isn't, frankly, a good fit, and I do need to get more hands-on. But what's very cool, though, is when we have the ability to present to somebody the ability to solve a more sophisticated problem that, frankly, requires data science techniques, but doesn't require the need to hire hardcore data scientists or AI scientists to be able to make it work. That's where AutoML comes into play. The other piece too, frankly, deals with rapid prototyping. One thing that I see a lot more of, and I think that if there's one big shift or one next step in the evolution of using data to solve problems in business, it has to do with this notion of scenario modeling or rapid prototyping. The what-if analysis at scale, being able to see based on a forecast, based on a plan, right? What happens if this has an issue, right? Perfect real-world example is what happened last year in March, right? When all hell broke loose. The trend that we saw in business, I'm a supply chain guy, right? And so this is extremely relevant to my line of work. People moved away from technology, not towards it. Why? Because they couldn't trust it. They knew that the historical data that went into these systems to generate a forecast or to define a replenishment plan or an assortment plan or an allocation plan was just going to be wrong. I was so far off the mark based on what was happening in March that I just can't trust it, right? And so what people are going to do, there's always going to be the challenge of having a lack of trustability with my historical data, because historical data is historical data. You can't, I mean, it is fact, right? You cannot change it. However, what I can do is proactively model scenarios and simulate what I think could happen based on real-world constraints. What happens if all of a sudden I lose half of my ships? What happens if the entire East Coast goes down because of a weather storm, right? And now I can no longer fulfill out of any of those warehouses, right? That, I think, is the real-world type of scenario modeling that I think, are going to be able to do a lot more of at scale. And frankly, that's one of the big aspects that I'm personally championing here at Domo. When we think about what are good high-impact AIML use cases, I think this is a good way of talking about the attributes of those problems. We have a nice little library here that we've been developing, both internally as well as in partnership with RxA, that deal with various industry problems. I think one defining characteristic that we want to look for is how cross-applicable is it, right? We want this to act as a building block that we can apply to a bigger, better problem, right? And frankly, absorb it into the larger solution. The second piece has to do with value definition, macro and micro. So this problem, and this is where I get back to my soapbox issue or topic of what's the use case, right? Is this use case must fit into a larger business process that has irrefutable value associated with it at a high level. Ultimately, what we want to do, and what frankly we're after at Domo here, is getting more embedded into a workflow such that we are directly influencing the three things that any company cares about, which is revenue, cost, or risk. If I can literally directly say, making this decision is going to help you sell more, or making this decision is going to help you be more efficient with this process, therefore reducing cost, or this is the impact of this risk that's going to be taken on, right? That means that we're having much greater impact on what the business is solving, and frankly, the business case all around, right, is a much more justifiable across the board. But also from a micro perspective, think about that poor AI scientist I mentioned earlier that I used to work with, right? How do we get that guy from working at 95% of his time messing around with data to 50% of his time, right? Or 20% of his time. I don't know, 20% of his time is maybe a little bit lofty goal, but we'll see what we can do, right? So from an individual perspective too, I want to make everybody happy, right? We want to make data fun. And the more that we're combing through the weeds, messing around with it, having to get bogged down in those death by 1,000 paper cuts aspects can get pretty tough, right? And then the last piece is, how does this tie into the larger experience that I'm trying to convey? Again, the user of this is not going to be the data scientist or the practitioner. The user of this needs to be the business person, right? I think a couple of years ago, a friend of mine asked, what do you think is the most, when do you think we've made it in AI, right? What do you think that looks like? And I didn't have a very good answer, but the first thing that came to mind was we've, quote unquote, made it when people stop realizing that AI exists, right? When it's fully transparent to the people using it. And because that's the case with all technology that we use on a daily basis, when it just is so naturally embedded that A, it's trustable, right? So even though it's transparent, I trust that it exists. And I think we're in a big shift right now, especially with data privacy and security related subjects that come up every day, right? That's a big characteristic that we're after. So remembering that my data person is not necessarily the consumer of this information, it's the business experience that I've wrapped around it, and how does it fit seamlessly into that, okay? So at this point, I've got a couple examples. Whoops, shifted ahead here. There we go. A couple customer examples here, but that's about it for the main topics that I wanted to cover on my end. I think that what I like about these is that they're pretty specific, they're punchy. So for example, universal big R factory. We've got flexibility within the tool to support Python, R, Jupyter, right? And having that flexibility is a big help, right? Because frankly, they're good for different things. We use a lot of Python, for example. Python doesn't always need to be a data science tool, or doesn't always need to be an algorithmic vessel, right? It can be used for additional supplemental application development, for example, and additional business logic that I might want to embed. Whereas R, dyed-in-the-wool data science language, right? With TripAdvisor here on the right, this was a big use of Python to kind of complement the R. The next slide here deals with some AutoML examples. What I like about both of these is both have to do with the notion of rapid prototyping, right? So in the case of Arthrex, they had a product launch pipeline, this project management concept that required a lot of iteration, right? And frankly, they do a lot of repeated steps, but there's enough specificity in between those steps that they've got to iterate each time they do it, and that got difficult. And obviously behind the scenes, the math was pretty complex. And so using AutoML, they were able to do this much more efficiently, and frankly, with just a click of a button, you wait a couple minutes and poof, there's your answer, as opposed to having to really hire an army of scientists to help support this. Then likewise with Freddy Frozen Custard, this is a nice complement to Arthrex, totally different industry here, but they don't, this is a frozen custard company, right? They're not going to be in the business of hiring massive armies of scientists, and yet they're still able to solve sophisticated problems that were previously unsolvable because they're making use of Autopilot, which is ultimately the underpinning of our AutoML functionality. So I think the main kind of what we talked about here is to the AI practitioners on the phone, probably not a whole lot, right? This is a very dense subject, and this is very multifaceted. I talk a lot internally about how this is a system dynamics problem. If this was easy to solve, if there was any one thing that was at the root of making AI sticky, we would have solved it, right? This is a very multifaceted challenge that not just encompasses technology problems, but also encompasses business ones and operational ones and organizational ones, right? And of course, data is its underpinning, right? We have a real opportunity with its usage. I think if we put the right roadmap in place, I think the best thing that we can do as champions of the good fight for this is remember my roadmap. How am I going to start small, get the wins, and continually reinforce that this is a good idea to the people who are investing in this? I mentioned at the very beginning that I worked with a company I've worked with a couple companies who've spent over $100 million on AI COEs. One of the reasons that it failed was that in one case it was under the auspices of a larger digital transformation that took place, and it got very difficult to understand on a frankly month-to-month basis what the wins were. Why am I doing this? They were so laser focused on what's going to happen in 5 years that they forgot to remind everybody why we're here in the first place and kind of show those wins as we went along. And I think that's a real valuable lesson to be learned. The advantage there too is it frankly teaches us along the way. If all I'm doing is going for broke and that, trying to throw the Hail Mary down at the end of the end zone, I forget to move the ball forward inch by inch. All right, so thank you very much. That's it for my end. I think we've got a couple questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Colin, for all the information on Domo and AutoML. We do have a couple questions here. The first one being, what are a couple examples of a customer who has implemented Domo to its, quote, maximum potential?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are, I guess, a couple ways we could talk about that. There's one good one that I like is Titan America. They're an industrial manufacturing company specializing in the manufacturing of concrete. And what I like about manufacturing as an industry is that they're typically a very data mature industry. Really since the advent of the ERP in the 90s, data has been a thing, right? And contrast that to retail, where retail's probably only been really interested in data for probably about the last 10 years. And so manufacturing, there is an incredible amount of maturity with looking to data to solve problems. The challenge that they've had, though, is that they've invested in a lot of technologies and have been struggling to get the value out of them. Industrial IoT as a concept, I remember working on IoT projects 15 years ago, right? IoT in particular has had a weird sinusoidal, life. And so in Titan's case, they run Domo, they use Domo to basically run their plants. And so they've got a whole bunch of edge devices that are monitoring, obviously, the operations within the manufacturing execution and the plants themselves. They're providing, and we're reading straight from the devices in some cases, and also the historians for those of you IoT nerds, right? So we're reading the OT environment, bringing that into Domo, and providing effectively near real-time insights into what matters, providing alerts and thresholds, right? So it's a very managed by exception sort of environment, which means that the operators on the plant floor actually go to Domo as their first place to look, right? Because it's a very consolidated, holistic view of what's happening in my manufacturing. And then we also point to where the problem will lie if something is taking place. The other piece that we do with it, that they're using Domo for, though, is that bigger picture piece. Things like predictive maintenance. When do I think a pump is going to fail, or a process, whatever? And then, of course, management and leadership sort of modeling. If I know the operational impact of what I'm monitoring, it's very easy to codify that or roll that up into higher level KPIs that, say, the head of the plant or head of manufacturing, right, or the CFO might care about.
Thanks.
Oh, and they're using a lot of data science. Figured went with the territory, but.
We have a question from Matt Hill. Is there Domo training on how to use the AutoML, et cetera, tools?
There is. Full transparency, it's it's being built as well, right? So there's a lot that, because we rely on AWS Autopilot behind the scenes, SageMaker Autopilot, right? So some of the documentation comes from them, some of the documentation we create. I think the main value add and the main focus of our documentation for our data science, and particularly AutoML, has to do with how do I get data into it and then use it, right? Because obviously the experience is kind of Domo crafted, right? And so there is some of that. We also obviously have a bunch of support teams that can help as well if there are any gaps that exist in that.
Thank you. Another question here asks if you can give any additional examples of how Domo allows business users to manage their experience and solve problems on their own.
Yeah, well, AutoML, we've spent some time talking about AutoML, and I like that a lot because it's a very technical thing that they're doing, that they're able to manage. I think one big example we see a lot of is it helps if you compare the way things were, so to speak, or kind of the more traditional state of things to where we want to take things. So think about what it has traditionally taken to manipulate data and be able to translate it into a report or a dashboard or an experience, right? Typically, that was something I had to offload to an IT group because only they understood the data. First and foremost, I think part of that is because there were some literal technical limitations in being able to understand that. So brokering the communication of those systems is a good example. How do I literally get the data out? But the other piece too is a more functional one, frankly, and there's no real reason why a business person can't own this. The challenge, though, is that historically we haven't presented it to them in a way that they understand, right? In a way that we experience. I can drive a car with a laptop, but why would I do that if I have a steering wheel and a gas pedal, right? And I think that's the same attitude with being able to have Domo being more self-service, right? Is that if you're going to enable new user communities and make the business the focus of that, you also have to provide the underpinnings and the user experience that makes it a lot more seamless. So a lot of things like drag and drop functionality, a lot more automation and alerting, right? Obviously, error handling is a big piece. You don't want somebody to make it do something that they shouldn't have, right? So those are some of the things that we talk about a lot.
Okay, we have another question from John Hawk. Do you have a guideline for the kind of data a startup company should gather when they start selling products?
Ooh, a startup company. First question I would ask is, what kind of company is it? Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one because the first question I ask, what do you want to, what's your value prop, right? What are you trying to sell? Yep.
He responded with consumer hardware.
Oh, cool. I would say I need to know what your SKUs are, right? What's my market? What's my path to that market, right? How am I going to sell into that market? What are the attributes of my SKUs and what makes them valuable, right? Or how do I want to track those SKUs? What makes one SKU unique from the next, for example. If I break that, if you're in the business of say, assembly manufacturing or discrete manufacturing, what are the component parts that go into that SKU that are relevant to my operations? Right, if I'm receiving a fully assembled subassembly, for example, I may not necessarily need to care about the component part pieces. I might if there's a spares logistics aspect, right? For example, if I'm going to be on the hook, so let's take, for example, car seats. Car seats come with the seat rails and the knobs and the upholstery, everything on it, right? Ultimately, the car manufacturer is on the hook for that entire car, for that entire seat, even though the seat might come from Recaro, for example, right? So they're going to need to track that seat at lower levels of granularity, even though ostensibly what they've received from the car seat manufacturer, so Recaro, for example, is a fully assembled subassembly. So those are some considerations there. The last thing I'd say probably has to do with manufacturing complexity in the operations themselves. If there are sub-steps or pre-steps or pre-processing or value-added processing that takes place, right? So if you do customization work on this after the fact, or if there's pre-processing that takes place, and how that relates up my chain. The best thing that I like doing is define my value chain and understand what the data within that value chain is. So from the very beginning, the very most raw piece of, in this case, since we're manufacturing something, right, the raw materials that go into this, where am I going to get those? What's the type of data associated with it? And then all the way through to how do I make money off of this and how do I support my customers afterwards? I think that's probably a good way to model the data that would be required. I hope that made sense. I know that was a little circuitous.
Yeah, I think that's all the questions that we have for now, so I think we can hand it back over to Tom. Thank you
Great.
so much, Colin.
Thanks, guys.